Our goal this morning will be Esther chapters 8 through 10. I hope everybody got that email.
Oh, no.
Although I understand that some didn't.
Oh, no. I did not get that.
I'm sorry, Miss Carol.
When did you send it out?
When did we send it out? Thursday?
Oh, good.
So our plan was...
Jenny didn't tell me about it.
Well, I'm sorry that everybody had to hear that Miss Jenny failed you. So I think you'll be able to stay with us. You'll be fine. So the reason for that is we're this far along in Esther. Dad, in my absence, took us through the first 7 chapters, and so thought it made more sense just to go ahead and finish up the book rather than wait 2 or 3, 4 weeks and then come back and finish up the book. So, because Esther is very much narrative, and thought it made more sense to go ahead and complete the narrative. So this morning that's class 16 in your workbooks, and we'll complete that class this morning. And then on Wednesday, we'll go back and catch class 13, and then next Sunday, class 14. So I apologize for jumping out of order in that way. But we'll finish up Esther today, go back to class 13 on Wednesday, and we'll finish up Ezra. Does that make sense? Again, apologies for any confusion that we created there. So that's where we are, Esther chapter 8. If you don't mind bowing with me, we'll begin our class with a word of prayer. Lord, thank you for bringing us all here together this morning and keeping us all safe. And God, we see your hand in so many things around us, and we thank you for your care for us. We pray that we handle the things of your word correctly, and that all the classes here this morning and around the world that are done by your people that serve to strengthen and build us up and do all things to your glory. In Jesus' name, amen. So there are two brief conversations that are outside the scope of the questions that I wanted to tackle. One we'll tackle here at the beginning, and then we'll tackle the other one at the end. I wanted to very, very briefly just touch on the timeline, because I know this is not everybody's favorite conversation. But where are we? What time period are we in the book of Esther? And I did watch the classes. I noticed that Dad deftly avoided this question for the most part. No, he did touch on it a little bit. But if you go to the second page, if you do have the workbook, if you go to the second page of the workbook, there's a lot of debate about where in human history Esther actually happened. And I am not here to tell you that I've got the right answer. I've got an opinion, but it's just that. Wherever the big picture is, wherever the answer is, it still fits in our class, because our class is about Israel returning home. And in the big picture of Israel returning home, Esther fits in there somewhere. Where it is some debate. The kind of conventional, most commentators that you'll see, most secular sources that you see, they'll tell you that Esther happened about 480 BC, and I'm kind of on that top timeline if you're looking at the page in your book, during the reign of what secular history calls Xerxes the First. There's a lot of reasons that makes sense. The Hebrew or Aramaic translation of the word Xerxes is Ahasuerus, and I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that right. Ahasuerus, Ahasuerus. I'm not sure exactly which one of those is correct. But that Ahasuerus that many of that you see in the book of Esther, that king, that literally is the Aramaic translation of the Greek word Xerxes. And so that would be the strongest and most evident, piece of evidence that we're looking at King Xerxes. From history, if you in human history, if you're familiar at all with the movie 300 or the Battle of Thermopylae, any of those kind of things that in human history, that was King Xerxes, what history knows as King Xerxes, the king of Persia who had many famous battles with the Greeks there at Thermopylae and at Athens and in that part of human history. That's the Xerxes that most would say that Esther was the queen under. And if that's the case, then Esther would have been, that this narrative would have happened about 480 BC, if that's accurate. There are some who would put Esther later in the timeline, all the way back to perhaps 440, 460 BC. There are others who would say Esther perhaps fits in the reign of King Darius, which is kind of my personal, whatever that's worth, opinion, which would put her about 510 BC. One of the, and I don't want to go through all of the arguments for that again, but one of the things that kind of makes me want to place Esther a little earlier in the timeline, if you'll turn with me to Esther chapter 2 and verse 5, there's this point that's made about Mordecai. Verses 5 and 6. Esther 2, verses 5 and 6. Somebody care to read those this morning? Tara, will you read those for me?
Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away.
Okay, so the most straightforward reading of that verse says what? Yes, the most straightforward, the simplest reading of that verse says Mordecai was in Jerusalem and he was taken with the captives that went to Babylon with Jeconiah. We can date that. If that's what that verse is saying, and again, the straightforward reading of that verse is that's what it means. We know when that happened. When did Jeconiah and those exiles, when did they get carted off to Babylon? When was Jerusalem destroyed? 586 BC. We can be confident in that date. So if it is true that Mordecai was carried to Babylon with the exiles, and again, that's what that verse appears to be saying, then he was alive, even if he was an infant, he was alive in 586 BC. Okay? If Esther really was queen under Xerxes, what secular historians call Xerxes, then she was alive. Her story happens about 480, 475 BC, which means Mordecai's 100 years old, maybe 105. I'm not saying that's impossible, but it strains the narrative a little bit. If Esther happens a little earlier, if Esther happens in the reign of Darius, Mordecai is 65 to 75 years old. Again, I don't want to make more of that than I need to. Maybe I'm misunderstanding the verse here in Esther chapter 2. That's one of the reasons I want to make Esther a little bit earlier. It just makes Mordecai's timeline make a little more sense to me. Again, just wanted to make that to kind of make that point briefly. I'm not dogmatic about it at all. Esther could be way later. Maybe that verse means that he was in the womb of his mother, that he was, or he was still yet to be born, but his family was taken to captivity. I'm not sure. But again, the most straightforward reading of that seems to indicate that he was alive when Jerusalem was destroyed. And if that's the case, Esther's probably a little earlier in the timeline. Yes, ma'am.
If the temple was finished in 516, and you're saying that this took place maybe 510, that makes more sense than, because they're wanting the people to learn the law of Moses and the law of God.
And yeah, how does this interact with Ezra in that timeline? I think that is an interesting question. We're going to talk a little bit more about that at the end, Miss Carol. Why is Jerusalem, Ezra, Why is that stuff not mentioned in Esther is a good question, but I think it feeds to that point. I think that timeline does make sense. There's definitely issues with that timeline, but there's issues with any of the timelines. Again, that's just one of the reasons that makes sense to me. Any other thoughts? I don't want to spend time on that. I know it's not everybody's cup of tea, but just throwing that out there for your own study. So, I don't want to rehash all the first 7 chapters of Esther. If you've been in this class, I think that was, we covered that very well. Everything that happened with Ahasuerus and the banquets that he put on, and then everything with Vashti, and then we had the Bachelor Susa edition where he auditioned all these young women to see which one was going to be his wife. Esther is chosen. We know all that story. Haman and his interaction with Mordecai, and finally, he gets his just dessert, so to speak, in chapter 7. But as we get to chapter 8, we've gotten rid of Haman, but we still have this other significant problem, which is what? The decree still stands. And what do we know about laws of the Medes and Persians? They're the most solid things on earth. They don't go away. We've already run into this one time in our study. Anybody remember where that was? With Cyrus's decree. That's exactly right. Because remember, they went back and said Cyrus made this decree, and that stopped the whole proceeding. So, well, if Cyrus made this decree, we got to go check it out because decrees can't be changed. And you also see this just in terms of Bible study. You see this happen with Daniel. The king didn't necessarily want to throw Daniel in the lion's den, but he made this decree. So the king seemed to be real fast and loose with making the decrees, but then when they made them, they were really solid. So we've still got this decree that, and what, in your own words, what was the decree of Haman? That there was going to be an extermination of the Jews on this specific date. And that date, if you...
12 months later.
Yeah, this, and again, that's, in my judgment, part of God's providence is when we cast the lots to figure out when this day was going to be, it was much later in the calendar. It's in the 12th month. And so, which would have made it, by the way, would have made spring time frame, February, March time frame. But, so Haman's in the first month when he makes this decree, and he says, hey, in the 12th month of this year, the Jews are going to be exterminated. And as we stand in Esther chapter 8, that decree is still on the books. That 9 months from now, at this point, a couple months have passed, 9 months from now, all the Jews are going to be exterminated. So that's the problem that we have as we begin Esther chapter 8.
It's interesting that they didn't realize that Esther was a Jew at that point when the decree was made the first time.
Yes.
It might have changed. But
And apparently didn't know until, Esther chapter 7, which is interesting. Because it seems that there was some understanding that she was a foster child of Mordecai, and Mordecai was well known as a Jew. That was his stated reason for not worshiping Haman, or not bowing before Haman, but somehow nobody made the connection. I'm not sure. I think there's more to the story there that we don't know, probably, why Esther was able to conceal that part of her identity. Anyway, so Esther chapter 8. Let's look at question 1, and I think we'll go through the narrative as we go through these questions. First thing that happens in Esther chapter 8 is Ahasuerus gives something to Esther. So what is Esther given in chapter 8? So it says in verse 1 that she's given the house of Haman. What does that mean?
the property, slaves, servants, everything that I guess he would have said was his.
And what do we assume Haman? So yeah, she was given everything that would have been Haman's, his possessions, his property, his servants. And what do we assume that Haman would have had? A lot of stuff.
Number 2 man in the kingdom.
At this point, what do you think Esther would have had? Not a lot that we know of. We know that she was, very poor when she was chosen to her position. The king offers her things many times, up to half the kingdom. Ahasuerus was pretty fast and loose with what he offered people. But we don't really know of any evidence that Esther had a lot of possessions. Now, she had a lot of servants that waited on her, but they were Ahasuerus' servants, really. So we don't know that she had much. But here in chapter 8, she's given quite a bit. She's given the estate, if you will, if you want to use kind of our modern words. She's given the estate of Haman. Everything that was Haman is now hers. And what does she do with this property? She kind of places Mordecai in charge of it. You can see that in verse, is that 2? And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. I kind of take that to mean it's still hers. She's the owner, but he oversees it. And maybe I'm not reading that right, but at least that's how I read it. So Mordecai, and something else is given to Mordecai pretty significantly in verse 2. The signet ring. Now, again, this is so strange to me because when something is sealed with this signet ring, what happens? I mean, it is unchangeable, but somehow we're just giving the signet ring around like it's a prize at the fair. We just give it to anybody. So we gave it to Haman, and he makes this decree, but now Mordecai's the guy we like, and so we're going to just give him the signet ring. Why Ahasuerus is passing this thing around is somewhat bizarre in this story, but he gives it to Mordecai. And so now Mordecai has the ability to make edicts and laws, and they are completely unchangeable. So that happens in verse 2. It's pretty significantly.
It's a bad drinking problem. Perhaps he's drunk all the time.
That is not unlikely. I mean, one thing we know he's good at is throwing a banquet, and that is about the only thing that we see in this book that he's really, really good at. He's not particularly good at picking advisors. Well, the whole story of the book of Esther, we're going to talk about that later. What's the whole story of the book of Esther is God's providence works through some strange people. And Ahasuerus kind of fits that criteria. So, again, we still got this edict, but now Mordecai has the signet ring. And so question 2 is, what edict did Ahasuerus allow Mordecai to write? And how did it neutralize that edict of Haman? One question I didn't ask, but I thought was interesting. If you look at Esther chapter 8 and verse 4, what does Esther do in chapter 8 and verse 4? She approaches the king. What's significant about that?
It's the same thing. She has to please him to it has to be his will to have her to come in.
Yes.
She's already done that once before.
Yes.
So it's her life.
It is. Yeah, it not as big a deal is made of it here in chapter 8, but I think it's the same risk that we read about in earlier chapters, that Esther was not summoned in chapter 8, but she went before the king again. All the same bravery, all the same risk, all of those. Remember that conversation we had about how incredible that she made that decision? Well, she made that decision again here in chapter 8. But anyway, thought that was interesting. So Ahasuerus allows Mordecai to write this edict. And in your own words, what does this edict say? So it's very bizarre, and I'm not sure that I fully understand it, but it doesn't just say, hey, you remember that old law? Let's forget about that. It doesn't say that at all. It says instead, and the language is very, very similar, the things that the enemies of the Jews were going to be able to do to the Jews, now the Jews are going to be able to do to them. And in fact, it really goes even beyond what the enemies of the Jews were allowed to do. If you look at the edict specifically, let's see.
Verse 11.
Yes, verse 11, thank you. Esther chapter 8, verse 11. The king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and to fill their lives. Now look at this. What the edict says, they were allowed to destroy, kill, and annihilate. Pretty strong language. Again, the same language that was used in the Edict of Haman. The armed forces of any people or province that did attack them, that might attack them. They were able to go after anybody that they thought might be a problem, preemptively, that's pretty significant. that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. That is pretty strong language that Mordecai authored here. And we'll talk more about that later, but just put a note on that. What do we really think about this edict? Was it a good thing? It was a good thing in that it allowed the Jews to defend themselves. It was a good thing in that it allowed the nation to continue. It was a good thing in that the Jews were not exterminated. But the actual language and what it allowed was pretty interesting. So that's the Edict of Mordecai. And obviously we can see how it kind of neutralizes or changes the effect of the Edict of Haman. Any other thoughts or comments about this Edict of Mordecai?
That edict was written for the same day.
Yes.
Verse 12.
Yes.
That they could only do it, I read it as you can only do it that one day.
Agreed. That is how that was written. So this day was supposed to be for the extermination, but instead we're going to allow the Jews to defend them. Like, why do they need an edict to be able to defend themselves? This is interesting. But they are allowed to go against their enemies on this day. Again, thank to Fred's point, on this same day, on this 13th day of the 12th month. This is, as much as it is about the law itself, it's very much also just about signaling to the people who has the king's favor, right? If you think about it in that way, that this edict, is as much as the first edict was about extermination of the Jews, it was also about the fact that the Jews are not welcome in Persia. In this second edict, as much as it's about the Jews defending themselves, it's also signaling to the whole empire the Jews are welcome in the empire. You're allowed, you would be a friend of the king if you would help them. You know, they're allowed to defend themselves and against whoever might be their enemy. And by the way, you better be careful if you are an enemy of them because they can come after you. So, you know, as much as it is about the nuts and bolts of them defending themselves, it's also just kind of a message to the empire, the Jews are welcome here. And I think that's significant. A very dramatic turnaround from where we were just a couple of months ago.
I think the end of that verse 17 where it says, you know, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast, a holiday, then many of the people of the land became Jews.
Yes.
Because fear of the Jews fell upon them.
Yes.
Mordecai now, the prime minister or second, whatever in command, earns great respect from all the people, and a lot of people are converting to Judaism.
Many people become Jews in verse 17 of chapter 8. Why do you think they became Jews?
Latter part of the verse says, fear of the Jews fell upon them.
Yes. So, now, could some have been genuinely convicted by the providence of God and genuinely proselyted? No question. I'm not going to deny that certainly probably did happen. But there's also just a fear factor. What's the best way to prove you're not an enemy of the Jews? Become a Jew. And so, if you got any indication in your mind, you know, they might think I'm an enemy and they can just come kill me, according to this edict. Like, it's the purge of all the enemies of the Jews. The best way to avoid that is just become a Jew. No, guys, I'm one of y'all. I'm good. So, it was the fear that, to Jeff's point, the fear that provoked a lot of that. And again, just the thought among the empire that the Jews are welcome here and that they're going to be a feared people. It's pretty significant. That's an enormous change of mindset for the whole empire versus where we were after Haman's decree. So let's look at question 3. The timeline between those decrees. We already talked about it a little bit, but just to make that concrete, the decree, this all happens within one Jewish calendar year. Everything from chapter 3 to the end of the book of Esther happens within one Jewish calendar year. The decree of Haman happens in what month of that year? First month. So, again, their calendar doesn't match our calendar, but just put it in terms we would understand. So, January of their year, Haman makes his decree. The decree of Mordecai happens in what month? The third month. And the actual, this effective date of both these decrees, because as Fred has said, they both had the same date, effective date, happened on, that date was in what month? The 12th month. So again, just kind of get a feel for the timeline. There was about 2 months between the decrees. A lot happened in those 2 months, obviously. So the decree of Haman comes out in month 1. All of the interaction with Haman and Esther and Ahasuerus happens in months 1, 2, and 3. The decree of Mordecai comes out in month 3. And we've got how many months to prepare? About 9 months. We've got about 9 months to prepare for this effective date of these decrees. Can you imagine? Yes. So, and in fact, there's a verse that talks about the confusion that was in Susa, right? I think that's is that in chapter 3? Chapter 3 and verse 15, the city of Susa was thrown into confusion by the first decree. You can only imagine what happened after the second decree. We just had a royal, herald come to our town and tell us to exterminate all the Jews, like 2 weeks ago. And now the same royal herald is coming to our town and telling us that, listen, you might want to become a Jew because they're going to be destroying everybody else. Like that, to your point, that had to be extremely confusing. How do you know who to believe or what to do? And I think that the 9 months, that the providence of God in allowing that 9 months for the truth to kind of be spread across the empire was important. If it had been a few weeks, it would have been very chaotic. It was chaotic as it was, but at least there was 9 months to kind of prepare and for the true edicts to make it across the vast empire. So that's a very good point.
Interesting in chapter 8, verse 7, after this second decree.
Yes. Did the city shouted and rejoiced? Yes. So Roger points out that in chapter 8 and verse 15, even the city of Susa shouts and rejoices. They were very confused after the first one. It seems like they're pretty happy after this one. Part of that, remember, is the city of Susa, as a lot of these empires were, had a lot of foreigners in it, not just Jews. And if you're a foreigner from somewhere else, you said, man, if they wipe out the Jews, they can just as easily wipe out us. So it seems like the whole city is much more pleased with the decree of Mordecai than they were with the decree of Haman. That's a very good point from chapter 8, verse 15.
My feeling is there were a lot of Jews in Susa.
Yes.
That were very wealthy and influential.
Yes, there were certainly Jews in Susa also. Remember, the Jews in Babylon had done very well, and some of them had gone to Susa. We know Daniel did. So some of them had gone to Susa. And so, yeah, and if you are friends with some of those people, imagine how you feel. So it's interesting that the city of Susa was certainly in favor of this second decree. It's a good point. Anything else through chapter 8? We touched on a lot of the questions that are in number 4, the reversal of fortune, how, to Nancy's point, how strange that had to be to get these 2 edicts. You know, there were sackcloth and ashes 2 months ago, and now and I should have mentioned, I noted in that question chapter 9, but I should have also mentioned chapter 8 and verse 17. There was gladness and joy and a feast and a holiday. There was a dramatic reversal of fortune for the Jews here. I don't think we can overstate what a roller coaster this had to be for the Jews. And to Jeff's point a moment ago, no one was willing to stand against them. And that's verse, let's see, is that verse 2? Yeah, verse 2 of chapter 9. No one's willing to stand against him. It's pretty common knowledge after this second edict that the Jews are welcome here. They're going to defend themselves. You may want to think about becoming one if you got the opportunity. No one was willing to come out and really be against them. I bet that was a dramatic change from after the first edict. People are pretty fickle. After the first edict, there was probably a lot of anti-Semitic Persians. After the second edict, I bet there was far fewer. Everybody all of a sudden liked the Jews. It was way more convenient to like the Jews or even become a Jew.
I wonder how public Mordecai and so that made them fear the Jews as well. This is what happened. Haman was kind of high up in the king's
Yes.
ranks, and then all of a sudden he was executed.
Yes.
And they, Mordecai refused to basically worship him. And
So Tara said, well, was it what happened to Haman that kind of changed some of that mindset about the Jews? And that's possible. Haman's execution was very public, remember? I mean, you could see that gallows from a long way away, especially in Susa. And so how public was that interaction between Haman and Mordecai? That very well may have something to do with that also. That's a good point. So you read in chapter 9 what actually happens on this day. Again, very bizarre. Jews all over the empire take vengeance on their enemies. How many total, according to the narrative here in Esther, were killed of the Jews' enemies? 75,000. Again, that's a pretty significant number. In the terms of the total population of the empire, a very small percentage. But 75,000 is a pretty good number. Susa probably had quite a large population at this time. And how many were actually in Susa on the first day? 500. And then, what did Esther ask of the king? She asked for a one-day extension in Susa. Again, somewhat bizarre. Must have been some more enemies that she knew of that needed to be ferreted out. Give us one more day to catch them. And so that is allowed, and that's in verses 11 through 15. So 500 in Susa on the first day. Esther is given a one-day extension, and then 300 more enemies of the Jews are killed on day 2.
Michael?
Yes, sir.
Could her request possibly be related to the hanging of Haman's 10 sons? Have time for that to take place?
Yes, so that's one thing she asked for. That's very possible. It's a good point. And again, to Tara's point about just the overall mindset on those that would have followed Haman versus now kind of following the Jews, these hangings of Haman's sons were very public also. And so, Esther did ask for that extension of time to complete that public display. So let's talk about question 5. I know we already in earlier classes talked about Purim a little bit, but what do we know about the holiday of Purim?
Still exists.
It still happens. And it still happens on the days as designated in the book of Esther, on the 14th and 15th day of Adar. That would have been the day after the date of this extermination decree.
Day 2.
What's that?
So this has been day 3?
I'm
Confused about that. So we got the first day that it happened, the second day was extended, so is this holiday?
So the holiday is intended, is my understanding. So remember the decree of Haman and then the subsequent decree of Mordecai were the 13th day of the 12th month. The celebration was intended to be the day after that. So for most all of the kingdom, all Jews, the celebration of Purim is on that day after, the 14th day of the 12th month. But because Esther asked for this one-day extension, there is which would have been the 14th day, right? So in Susa, it went to day 14. There is an extension of Purim to day 15, the day after that, for Jews. And for whatever reason, now it's become that Jews in Jerusalem celebrate it on the 15th. I'm not sure of the connection there.
Is that still called that today?
It is. It's still called,
Holiday we hear about, like Yom Kippur.
it's still called Purim. There's a real kind of interesting conversation about what do we think about Purim. Purim is, as celebrated today, we would not be too keen on Purim. We might like what it represents, but did anybody do any study? What is Purim about?
It's like Mardi Gras.
Purim is Mardi Gras. I mean, it is wild. It is. Here's a couple of quotes from rabbis. Here's a couple of quotes about Purim. On Purim, anything is allowed. Okay? Again, from a rabbi. On Purim, drink wine until you are no longer able to distinguish between blessed be Mordecai and cursed be Haman. It sounds like Mardi Gras, doesn't it? There are what do you call it when you yes, kind of, you put on a mask and you dress up, whatever, there's a word there, costumes, whew! You put on costumes and you go out and you drink until you can't tell the difference between Mordecai and Haman anymore. That's Purim. Is there any indication in the book of Esther that God asked for this to be a... So this is a man-made, man-ordained holiday, and it's spiraled into something I'm not sure God would approve of. Let me rephrase that. It's spiraled into something I'm pretty confident God would not approve of. And it's still celebrated today. It is the cut loose day for the Jews. Just for whatever it's worth, one of the arguments that the Nazis used in their extermination of the Jews in the lead up to World War II was that there was a German Purim that was coming. That was one of the terms that they used. Like, if we don't get rid of the Jews, they will get rid of us. There will be a German Purim. That was a term they used. When one of the, I can't remember the name, when one of the Nazis that was convicted at Nuremberg was taken to the gallows, his last words were, "This is Purim." Like, this is the Jewish retribution on Gentiles. So, like, this idea of this Purim, that there would the turning of the Jews against their enemies, pretty interesting. It's made it through secular history quite a bit as well. So, which gets us to question 6, and I'd like to change the question just a little bit. You know, what's the legacy of Mordecai? And I think, as Dad said in one of the classes, this book could just as easily be called Mordecai as Esther. He is just as key a figure in the book. So it kind of leads to a bigger question, and that is why, and we can talk about Mordecai's legacy, I think that's important. Why is Esther in our Bibles? And before we answer that question, and I think this has already been touched on in class, but think about what the book of Esther is really about. And also note what is not in the book of Esther. The name of God is not in the book of Esther. The name of Jehovah is not in the book of Esther. The name Lord is not in the book of Esther. Some interesting other things that aren't in the book of Esther. The city of Jerusalem is not mentioned in the book of Esther. The nation of Israel is not mentioned in the book of Esther. There's nothing in Esther about Abraham or Moses or Daniel. There's nothing about the promise. There's nothing about worship. There's nothing about grace. It's a really, really interesting when you think about what's not in the book. And how significant, if either one of our time frames that we've looked at, what was going on in Jerusalem at this time? There's a very significant thing going on in Jerusalem. The temple has been completed. We're working on the walls, depending on what you think the timeline of Nehemiah is. There's significant things going on in God's kingdom in Jerusalem. It's not given a passing reference here. Don't you think it would have been interesting to know what was happening in Jerusalem when they got these decrees of Haman and Mordecai? And we got nothing on that. And really, if you want to talk about it, the Jews that were in Susa, if they had been like really, really conscientious Jews that were hyper connected to God and wanted to do God's law, where do you think they would have been? They'd been in Jerusalem, yeah. So with all that being said, and what do we think about the decree of Mordecai? It's pretty vengeful, really. It's the end of the book of Esther, we typically think of it as a great celebration that the deliverance of the Jews. But we know that the real end of the book of Esther is the establishment of this pretty godless holiday. So Esther is strange to me. All the things that it doesn't have in it, and yet it's got, it's a story we all know. And so the question is, why is Esther in our Bibles? So we got 5 minutes to figure that out. Why is Esther in our Bibles? Nothing about prayer. Yeah, that's another one. Good point. Yeah. So what was the point before that? I missed it. I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, it teaches us to know that God, even though we don't realize that God's behind the scenes.
Yes.
A lot of people don't even realize He's saving you from so many things, and you don't even know He's done that because He don't let you know. But, you know, so He's letting the people know that the Jews are His people.
Yes.
And I think that transfers over to letting us know that the Christians are His people.
So those are two great points. I'm going to try to repeat them, and I'll try to do them justice. But Nancy says, whether or not it's said expressly, God is working throughout Esther. All of the little places that God's providence, and I know Dad talked a lot about providence, that God gets to His end through natural means. All of the little places where God's providence comes in. The fact that the king couldn't sleep on that very specific night. The fact that Mordecai was in the right place at the right time to hear about the threat against, the fact that Esther was chosen, the fact, all of the details that had to fall into place for this story to happen the way it did. There's no question God's hand was at work. By the way, and God's hand was at work through people who, a lot of whom may not have been great people. Ahasuerus being at the head of that list. And so God is at work. And then Carol makes the point, if there's the whole book, if you just look at what are we learning here, is that God took extraordinary efforts, extraordinary pains, and this is recorded for us, that God had a chosen people, and that He went to great lengths to protect them and make sure that they were indestructible. They weren't going to be annihilated. And if our whole point of kind of the book of Haggai, Zechariah, remember, was that Israel is not a race of people, but it's God's chosen people, that we are Israel today, then that's very significant. That Esther is not about the Jews, not about that race, but it's about Israel, about God's protection of Israel, about the protection of that race, even against, even when they didn't deserve it, that God was protecting them to bring about Jesus. If that's the big picture, that all of this is necessary in order to protect God's people, well, I think that's very significant. That God protects His people to His purposes. That there's been a lot of debate through the years about whether Esther should be in our Bibles. Should it be part of the canon? How many times is Esther quoted in the New Testament? 0. But if I perish is memorable, right? We definitely remember, maybe you've been sent to the kingdom for such a time as this. If I perish, I perish. God's protection. So there's definitely important lessons. But the bigger picture point of this is not about God protecting some race of people, in my judgment, but God protecting His chosen people throughout human history, and allowing His will to come through. If Haman's edict comes through, again, Mordecai would say something's going to happen. But if you allow your mind to go, what if Haman's edict comes true? What if the Jews are exterminated? There's no Jerusalem. There's no Jesus. That God, in His providence, could not allow that to happen. He protected these people in Susa who may not have deserved it, in order that His will might be done through history. Anyway,
Michael,
yes, ma'am.
in studying Ezra, this is where Ezra got these other people. The second wave that went back to Jerusalem was from the people that were saved, the Jews that were spared. Their lives were spared because he got together a contingency and went back to Jerusalem to teach God's law.
Yes. And
So He saved some of those people that went back were saved from.
part of the remnant, right?
Mm-hmm, they're part of the remnant.
Yeah, I think that's true. So I hope that has been this has been a good study for everybody on Esther, a good review of why do we have it in our Bibles. I would offer that it's probably not because Mordecai always made great decisions or that we should emulate. I'm not sure what I think about his edict if you really get down to it. But even Psalm 76 verse 10, even the wrath of men causes the glorify of God. Like he's going to get his glory even if it's through men that don't necessarily deserve it. I think that's what Esther's about, and God continuing to protect his people. Thanks everybody for their attention and comments this morning, and we will be in class 13. We'll go back and do lesson 13 on Ezra chapter 7 and 8. Thank you.